Welcome to Hard Times and True Crimes. Tonight we're taking y'all to Salisbury, North Carolina, a town with deep roots in Southern history. To understand what happened in 1906, you've got to know what life was like here, both before and after the Civil War. Salisbury was founded way back in the 1700s, a county set with red clay streets, horse-drawn wagons, and storefronts lining the square. By the 1830s and 40s, it was a small but bustling place. Taverns, churches, and a courthouse that anchored the town, and farms spread out in every direction. And families worked the land growing corn, wheat, and cotton, and many of the larger farms were ran with slave labor. Then came the Civil War. Salisbury was home to a Confederate prison camp, and the war years left the town battered. When the fighting stopped, Reconstruction brought its own troubles. Poverty, division, and a long, hard struggle to rebuild. Life was not easy, but Salisbury endured. By the late 1800s, things began to change. The railroad came through, and with it, new jobs, new faces, and a faster pace of life. Barber Junction, just west of Salisbury, became a little hub of its own. Trains whistling, steam and smoke rolling in, taverns coming and going. It was still mostly farmland, but now tied to a wider world. Life at the turn of the century was simpler in some ways. On a summer morning downtown, you'd hear wagon wheels cracking on brick streets, shopkeepers sweeping their stoops, and the bell at the courthouse marking the hour. On Sundays, families filled the pews in Rowan County's many churches, dressed in their best. At night, whippoorwills called from the trees, and the far-off rumble of the train reminded everyone that Salisbury wasn't as isolated as it once had been. By 1906, Salisbury was a mix of the Old South and the New Century. Farmers still plowed their fields with mule teams, but the town was lit with electric lights. Folks still gathered at the depot to watch the trains, but they also read newspapers that carried national headlines. It was a community proud of its roots, but also restless from the carrying memories of the war, the weight of the Reconstruction, and the transition of a changing, more dangerous world. And it was here, in a farmhouse just west of town, that the family lived, and where one summer night, Rowan County would be shaken by a crime that people are still talking about more than 100 years later.
I'm Darlene.
And I'm Melody.
This is Hard Times and True Crimes. If you've been wanting one of our shirts, we have got some available now, but we're also working on sweatshirts. They'll be ready probably just in time for cooler weather. And we're actually planning to be at if you're local, we are planning to set up at the Fall Festival here in Asheboro, which will be the first weekend of October. Come out and see us.
Yes, it'll be that Saturday, October the 4th.
This is a pretty local case from Salisbury, North Carolina that happened in 1906. I was just telling Melody, it's crazy, but my great-grandmother, who I spent a lot of time with as a kid, she was born in 1906. It's just insane how long ago 1906 was, but how it wasn't that long ago.
Right. Well, it was the turn of a new century,
yes,
if you think about it.
Yeah.
And that sounds like a very long time ago. And it was.
Right.
But now we've had the turn of another century.
On the night of Friday the 13th in July 1906, the Lyerly family ended their day as they usually did. After supper, the older girls helped their mother clear plates, wash dishes in the basin. They swept the floor, while the younger children, John and little Alice, played a game in the yard. And Isaac, nicknamed Ike, he was the father of the family, he sat outside and smoked a pipe. When the chores were all done, the girls and their mom stepped outside into the yard and joined the rest of the family. That was a common summer routine back then. The weather was so hot in July, And so it was just kind of a moment to catch a breeze before bed.
Yes.
Can you imagine that's a time before air conditioning?
No, and I do not want to imagine that.
The smoke from Isaac's pipe, it would have blended in with the smell of hog pens and all that stuff. It would have just carried in the air as the family chatted.
As we call it, fresh country air.
Exactly. They just hung out for a few minutes basically before bed while the little kids played. But morning came early, and before 9 p.m., 68-year-old Ike and his wife Augusta, who was about 25 years younger than him, she was 42, they went on to bed in the downstairs bedroom of their farmhouse. 10-year-old John and 6-year-old Alice slept in the room with them. So actually, John and Isaac were in one bed, and Augusta and Alice slept in the other. And that really wasn't that unusual for farm families at that time.
Okay.
Yeah, so bedrooms, they were often shared, and younger children typically slept with their parents. I mean, kind of for practical and, I guess, cultural reasons. Houses like the Lyerlys, they wouldn't have had central heat or electricity. And so obviously in the colder months, parents would keep their younger children for warmth.
I have a question about their age difference.
Yes.
Was she a second wife?
She was a third wife.
Oh, a third wife. Okay.
Yes.
And so these children are fairly young for him to be 68.
Yeah, they are.
Okay.
Yes. But in the summer, parents would often just co-sleep with their children for the sake of space and simplicity.
Sure.
Farmhouses usually had only 2 or 3 bedrooms. And so in the Lyerly home, the upstairs was used for the older daughters. So there was Mary, who was 17, Addie, who was 14, and then Janie, she was just 10. Her brother was 10, but probably she got kicked out when her little sister was born.
Yeah.
The little boy was 10, but he got to sleep with his dad.
And are these all children between that couple, or are these older kids from one of the other wives?
They're actually all hers.
Okay.
Yes. So the Lyerly house grew quiet as each member of the family would drift off to sleep. Upstairs, the older girls, Mary, Addie, and Janie, probably were whispering to each other in the dark before falling asleep. And then downstairs, Isaac and Augusta snuggled in with their little ones. But sometime around midnight, 14-year-old Addie would wake up. She had a really bad asthma, and any kind of smoke would cause her to have trouble breathing. So at first, she just smelled kind of a faint smell of smoke, but she sat up confused. The room upstairs was hazy and something was just off.
Oh, so quite a bit of smoke then.
Mm-hmm. She shook her older and younger sister, forcing them to wake up, and the 3 girls would stumble down toward the stairwell. The smell of smoke got thicker with each step. When they got to the bottom of the stairs, they went into their parents' room. Their mother's bed was on fire, but that was not the worst of it. Nothing could have prepared the sisters for what they were to see. So let me just give a warning here.
Oh, goodness.
On one bed lay their father, Isaac, and their brother, John. Both were lying still in awkward, unnatural positions. Their skulls had been smashed open, and their brains were spilling out from their heads.
Oh, goodness.
On the other bed, their mother, Augusta, lay with their youngest sister, 6-year-old Alice. Their wounds were just as terrible. The bedding around the mother and daughter smelled really strong, like kerosene. And, of course, we're on fire. Flames are burning the mattress, as well as Augusta and Alice. In a panic, the 3 girls started pulling and dragging at their loved ones, even though their bodies are probably heavy and lifeless, but they're desperate to try to save them from these flames. So even if they couldn't save their lives, one by one, they pulled their father, their brother, their mother, and Alice. Well, when they lifted Alice, even though she was unconscious and bloodied, she started moaning.
Oh, so
and she was breathing.
Still alive. Okay.
Mm-hmm. For over an hour, the girls fought that fire
Oh, my goodness.
and did everything they could to make their little sister comfortable
Oh,
and just tried to keep their families from being burned.
yeah. Oh,
So Mary, the oldest sister, hoisted Alice over her shoulder, and together with Addie and Janie, they stumbled out of the smoke and into this humid summer night. The three girls were barefoot, terrified, and in shock. As they took off walking along the property, they came upon an old occupied shack that their father owned. And suddenly Mary froze and turned to her sisters and said, "Be quiet. Do not make a sound."
oh.
She had a reason to believe that the people in that shack could be the ones that murdered her family.
Mm.
The girls were almost too scared to breathe at that point. They tiptoed past, holding their breath, praying that God would keep them safe. Can you imagine every break of the grass under your feet? Feeling like it could...
You can imagine that fear. You can almost feel it. Yes.
And finally, across the valley, through woods and briars, they saw the glow of a neighbor's lantern on the front of a cabin. So they let themselves just start screaming and running. Breaks my heart.
Yeah, those poor girls.
Mr. Philip Cook was the neighbor's house that they had ran to. He and his family were, of course, startled. They're like, what in the world's going on? They flung open the door to see these wide-eyed girls crying, talking all over each other, trying to explain what had happened with their family. So Miss Cook helps carry Alice inside and lays her on a bed, and the sisters are just piecing together what had happened.
I'm just amazed that they were able to carry her that far. It makes me think of when people, their adrenaline gives them like this supernatural strength to do stuff like that. I'm just like, that's pretty good ways to carry her.
It is. But my biggest thing is going past that cabin.
Yes.
Oh, my gosh. Yeah. So Mr. Cook, he wasted no time. He went and gathered some neighbors together, and within just a few minutes, a group of men made their way over to the Lyerly home. Isaac Lyerly, he was born in 1838 out in Rowan County, North Carolina. He came from a long line of German Lutherans who had settled in that area in the 1700s.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, he was third generation living in that home. Okay. So his father had raised his family in that home, and his grandfather had raised his family there. So the Lyerly name, it was well known in that county and tied to that area for generations. His daddy, Christopher Lyerly, took over his own father's farmhouse and fields, and he owned a plantation.
Oh, okay.
And like most plantations at that time, it was ran not just by the family, but by the enslaved men and women that they owned, who would live in those rough cabins down the lane, like in the property. The soil on their plantation was that familiar North Carolina red clay.
Oh, yeah.
They grew corn, wheat, rye, oats, and they raised hog for meats. Cotton and tobacco were grown, but Rowan wasn't a deep south cotton county. Grain was actually more important there.
Mm-hmm. We say that Rowan.
Rowan. Okay. You can tell I'm not a true North Carolinian. They also had an orchard where they grew apples and peaches, and a huge garden where they grew green beans, greens, and other staples. The slaves also had their garden. Isaac's nickname was Ike. I think I said that already. And he grew up surrounded by the sights and sounds of the country life there in Rowan County. He'd wake up to wood smoke drifting out of the chimney from his own family's kitchen and from those cabins. The fields were stretched wide with corn and wheat, and as a boy, he learned early how to ride horses, how to haul water from the well, and swing an axe into a hickory woodpile. He ate the food his mom made: cornbread, beans seasoned with pork, fresh milk from a cow. Sundays were spent at church. The Lyerlys sat in a pew at the Unity Presbyterian Church. That church is still there to this day.
Probably a still active body.
It
there.
is.
Yeah.
Yep. Enslaved families also attended that church, but they sat apart, or they would sit on in the balcony. For Isaac, that separation was just normal. It was the world that he'd grown up in. Wagons creaking down dirt roads, whippoorwills calling at night, voices drifting from the cabins mixed with the laughter of his brothers and sisters inside the farmhouse would have kind of been the soundtrack of his childhood. So Ike's boyhood was a mixture of very hard work and comfort, and I guess of duty and privilege. But when I say privilege, I don't mean he lived a soft life by today's standards, for sure. Privilege back then still meant waking up before day, hauling water from the well, splitting wood, plowing behind a mule, and sweating.
Absolutely.
In the sun.
Yeah.
What was considered comfort for a farm boy in the 1830s would be back-breaking labor today. But compared to the enslaved people, though, who worked his family's land from sunup to sundown, it was still easier.
Mm-hmm.
He had the security of his family, the prospect of education, and also inheriting. He was toiling for himself and not other people. So that was
backbreaking work, but for his own benefit.
Exactly. So that was kind of the balance of his childhood. Hard work by modern standards, but privileged in the world that he was born into. When Ike was 23 years old, the Civil War would break out. The North and the South were extremely divided back then. They were just like two different worlds. The North was industrializing, and they had factories, railroads, and growing cities. The South was mostly farmland, cotton, tobacco, wheat, and corn. For Southerners, tariffs were a big sore spot. The government passed these taxes on imported goods that protected Northern factories. So basically, Southerners would import a lot of what they needed because they didn't have factories.
Right.
So they would get their clothing, tools, and household items for cheap from England and France and places like that. But those tariffs really affected them. But they kind of protected the northern states because basically it forced the South to have to purchase from them at higher prices.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Am I saying that to where, okay. There was a lot of animosity over those taxes because a lot of Southerners felt like Washington was protecting the North and making the South foot the bill.
And these are some of those other issues that contributed to the Civil War.
Yes.
That wasn't just a one-issue war.
No, definitely not.
These were some of the other things that were contributing to just that conflict between these two sides.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and the other thing, too, was the internal improvements. The federal government was pouring money into northern canals, bridges, railroads, while southern communities were left with these dirt roads and just very, very little investment for their communities. And so that made them feel like stepchildren.
Right.
They didn't feel necessarily like a part of the Union. They felt like they were having to carry the weight of it, but they weren't reaping any benefits.
Right.
And then every time a new state was added to the Union, there was this fight over was it going to be a free state or a slaveholding state? Missouri, Kansas, California, when they came into the Union, all of them sparked huge, bitter debates in Congress.
They sure did. Mm-hmm.
There was a question of states' rights. Southerners believed that their state should have the final say in how it governed itself, taxes, trade, and even slavery. They argued that if the federal government could force its will on one issue, it could force its will on all of them. Slavery, though, I think was at the center of it all. It was tied into the Southern economy for sure. And it was tied into politics. And it was tied into that divide between the North and the South. But when people look back at the Civil War, we tend to picture it as a straight fight over slavery, but like you were saying, at the time, it was a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah. It's like you talk about people being complex and there's a lot of layers. And when we hear about the Civil War, a lot of times we just hear it in this simple one-dimensional.
Right.
But really, there were a lot of layers and a lot of other things that went into all of that during that time period. And there were some Southerners, I don't know that they were plantation owners, but there were some who were also against slavery.
Oh, yes.
But they just wanted to do it at a slower rate because to have done it just like one decision cut and dried would have destroyed their whole economy.
Right.
Because they wouldn't have any way to do this work where the North had their industry. And so they wanted to do it, but in a series of, a slower rate so that the South could keep up economically.
Right. The first wave of Deep South states that succeeded right after Lincoln was elected between 1860 and February of 1861, South Carolina, Mississippi, Georgia, and Texas, their leaders put it in writing, their official declarations and causes pretty much said that straight out that slavery was one of the main reasons that they were leaving the Union. Mississippi even wrote, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery."
Okay, so there it is.
Yes.
They straight up said that.
They did. They said the greatest material interest of the world was slavery. South Carolina complained that the North would not enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. Georgia and Texas both said slavery was at the heart of the conflict. But here in the Upper South, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, they were not so quick to succeed. In fact, North Carolina was one of the very last to leave. What ended up changing was April of 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston. In the Charleston Harbor. And for the first time, there was blood. And in response, President Lincoln called for 75,000 troops to put down the rebellion. And he expected troops from all the states, even other southern states, to get in on that. And that was kind of a breaking point for the upper southern states who weren't altogether happy with the North to begin with. They definitely didn't leave over the election, but they weren't about to send their sons to march against their southern neighbors.
Right. Yeah.
So it kind of felt like a matter of loyalty. And they really didn't feel like the North had been loyal to them. So Virginia went first, then Arkansas, then Tennessee, and finally on May 20th in 1861, North Carolina followed. And so Lincoln, I do want to say Lincoln, when he first became president, he did not make slavery the centerpiece of the war himself. What he said over and over again was that his number one goal was to hold the Union together. He knew the South had already broken away, and he was terrified that if the Confederacy gained recognition from Britain or France, the Union was not going to survive. And honestly, that really wasn't that far-fetched because if you think about it, Britain and France were some of the South's biggest buyers of cotton.
Yes.
But because of tariffs and taxation on goods moving in and out, trade was a really sore spot. So if those European powers had recognized the Confederacy and started buying directly from the South, it would have really left the Union weak and probably split it for good.
Yeah, and you got to know that every decision they make is going to be financially motivated.
Absolutely. As it is today.
Yes.
So Lincoln was very careful about how he talked about the war. He focused on preserving the Union, and he was also very cautious because he did not want to scare off those border states like Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland that still allowed slavery, but they had not succeeded. So if he turned the war into an immediate fight over slavery, he was risking losing them too. Then the North, they just weren't going to have the manpower or the resources. So it actually wasn't until 1863, after years of fighting, that Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation.
And after the South had won several of those battles.
Yeah, absolutely. It freed the enslaved people in Confederate-held states, And politically, he did two very smart things. One, it gave the Union a higher moral cause to rally behind, which boosted Northern support. And second, it kept Britain and France out of the war because both of those countries had already outlawed slavery, and there was no European power who was going to be seen back in the Confederacy. And so he used slavery kind of as political leverage to strengthen the Union's position. He was a shrewd politician.
Yes.
The beautiful twist is that in God's providence, it also became the defining moral victory of the war.
Exactly. And I'm glad you said that. That's exactly it. I actually heard a guy speak one time, a historian, and he said, and this was his opinion, he felt like God used the Civil War, because, there were a lot of great losses suffered on both sides of that war. And he said he felt like God used that to judge our nation for the institution of slavery to begin with.
Oh, yeah.
And, it was just, I thought, that's makes sense.
Oh, yeah, it really does. In the end, it reshaped the South forever, and it tore down that evil system that had stood for far too long. So God does have a way of bringing good out of brokenness. And in this broken world, the Civil War forced us to finally reckon with something we should have never allowed in the first place.
Right.
When the war started in 1861, Ike was a strong 23-year-old, and like a lot of men, felt that it was his duty to defend North Carolina. So he enlisted in Company C of the 49th North Carolina Infantry, a regiment filled with his neighbors and cousins. He was made a corporal and was responsible for leading others into battle. Isaac's first taste of combat came in the summer of 1862, during the 7 days battle outside of Richmond. He marched shoulder to shoulder with men he'd grown up with, musket in hand, heart pounding, and for the first time, he would see friends, families, and neighbors fall out beside him on the battlefield. It was a lot more brutal than what I just described. And weeks later came Antietam, which was the bloodiest day of the war. Cornfields were mowed down by bullets. 22,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing in that one day. He did survive, but what he saw there, he would never forget.
So he was actually in the Battle of Antietam.
Yes, I'm mentioning every one of the battles that he specifically was in.
Wow.
That winter, he was at Fredericksburg. He stood behind a stone wall while wave after wave of Union soldiers marched uphill into musket fire. That slaughter was beyond imagination. When the smoke cleared, the hillside was blue with bodies. They won, but it was a bitter victory because there had been just so much blood in that battle. And it wasn't just the battles. The men walked hundreds of miles, sometimes barefoot.
A lot of times barefoot.
Yes. By 1864, Confederate supply lines had collapsed. His feet were blistered and cracked. His toes bled as he marched sometimes 20 miles a day over gravel roads and frozen ground. At night, he would lay on the cold ground with just a thin blanket, shivering until dawn. Hunger was constant. Their rations would shrink to almost nothing. They lived off of cornmeal mixed with water, and sometimes, if they were lucky, they'd have a strip of half-rotten bacon. Sometimes they would pick green apples off of trees along the road, or they would chew raw corn. The air was never clean. It was filled with the stench of sweat and excrement and vomit. Men would go months without bathing. Back then, bathing just wasn't, for one thing, it just wasn't as common.
It was a luxury.
It was. Wool uniforms would be full of body odor, mud, and lice. And on the marches, they would pass rotting horses, unburied bodies. I don't think we could even fathom probably the smells that those men
I know. It kind of turns my stomach just listening to you describe it.
And if the marches didn't kill a man, disease often did. More soldiers died from sickness than from gunfire. Camps swarmed with fleas, typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, syphilis. If they ever ended up in a field hospital, and most of them did at some point or another, it would have been a barn or church converted into a hospital. Straw mats soaked with blood, surgeons sawing off limbs. Can you imagine? With no antiseptic. Imagine seeing amputated arms and legs stacked outside a door. The smell of chloroform, sweat, and death. Ugh.
It's really unimaginable.
It really is. PTSD, you got to know it was real.
Oh, yeah.
Medicine was crude, so they had mercury pills.
Oh, my goodness. So if the war didn't kill you, your medicine may.
Yes, they said that it poisoned more people than it cured.
I'm sure.
And then opium was used to numb the pain and, of course, got many of them hooked.
Mm-hmm.
Whiskey passed off as a treatment. For many of the soldiers, the hospital was a death sentence. And then in the winter of 1864, Isaac was 26 and worn down. He was in a trench that they had dug around Petersburg, Virginia, when Union troops ignited a mine beneath the Confederate line. The ground ripped open and soldiers were thrown into the air, human bodies blown apart, raining back down. The surviving soldiers fought hand to hand with bayonets, clubs, muskets, and even fists in that pit. And then April of 1865 at Appomattox, it finally ended. Ike would have been 27 years old. He stood with his fellow survivors as Robert E. Lee surrendered. They stacked their rifles. Some broke out into sobs. Others had blank stares, too numb and traumatized probably to know how to feel. Isaac had made it through 4 years of absolute misery. Barefoot marches, starvation, freezing nights, bloody battles, disease. He was alive. But he was not the same man that marched off at 23 years old.
Sure, and I bet that's probably true for most of them.
Mm-hmm.
They went in as boys probably.
Right.
And came out quite different.
And I told you all of this because when you hear at the end of his story as a gray-haired farmer in 1906, I want you to remember that this is a part of who he was.
Okay.
He had a whole life. I want people to have that holistic picture of him.
Yes.
So I can picture Ike walking the last few miles back from Salisbury along that same clay road he had played on as a kid. The farm was still there. It hadn't been kept up, but it was there. Even the house was still standing. The barns, the fields were there, but life was definitely changed. Rowan County itself hadn't been a battlefield like Gettysburg or Petersburg, as far as no great battles were fought there. But it was scarred in other ways, desertion and loss. Hundreds of young men from Rowan County had marched away with regiments like Isaac's and never come home. And so every family was touched by grief. Salisbury had also housed a large Confederate prison camp where thousands of Union soldiers were kept under pretty brutal conditions. In April of 1865, just before the war ended, Union General George Stoneman's cavalry raided Salisbury, freed the prisoners, burned government buildings, and tore up the rail lines. So this raid really shook that community. The economy, I always think about that song when I hear of Stoneman's cavalry. I think of
The Day Old Dixie
Died. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the economy was shattered. Confederate money was obviously worthless. Farms that had depended on slave labor were suddenly left without it. Families who used to measure wealth in land and slaves, they were starting all over from scratch. With so many dead men and disabled men, crime also rose in that area. Widows are walking around in black dresses, new freedmen searching for land and jobs, Confederate veterans limping home. It was war-torn in its own way.
Yeah. This makes me want to go back and watch that mini series, North and South. back from the 80s.
I need to do that too.
That was the first time that that's when I got my crush on Patrick Swayze.
Really?
Yeah, because he was in that,
I love to read about the Civil War. Not long after returning, Isaac found a reason to be happy again. He married a woman named Lydia Jane Rice on May 10th in 1865. She was also from a local family, and together they took over his father's household and farm in the years following the war. Their first son, Joseph Graham Lyerly, was born the next year in 1866. So the Lyerlys, they raised crops, they tended livestock, and he just kind of rebuilt his father's farm. And they did that everyday work of keeping the farm going without the wealth, I guess, and certainty that had probably existed before the war. Sundays were still spent at the Unity Presbyterian Church. Isaac and Lydia were married for about 17 years. And in that time, they raised their son and managed their farm. But then she would pass away in 1882, leaving Isaac a widower in his midlife. I think he was only 42 when she died. A couple of years later, in 1884, Isaac married again, this time to Sarah Elizabeth Gein, who was also from Rowan County. Their marriage was short. She actually did have a couple of children, but they died. I think they were stillborn. But she actually passed away in 1887. In 1888, Isaac married for the third and final time. His new wife, Augusta, Gussie, is what they called her.
That's cute.
That is cute. Berenger, she was 25 years younger than him. And with Augusta, Isaac started a whole nother family.
Yeah, he did.
They had several children together. So they had Mary, born in 1889, Addie in 1892, Janie in 1896, John in 1898, and then Alice was born in 1900.
So about every 2 years, she's having a baby. Of course, she was young, and I'm wondering how he found such a young wife, but it's probably not uncommon.
No, and I mean, he was probably wealthier. Mm-hmm. He was probably a good catch. I mean, he was in his 40s still. Yeah. So I can see when you're in your 20s.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe marrying somebody in their 40s.
Especially if they got that money.
And he was handsome. I saw a picture of him. Really? I thought he was handsome. I don't know like how old he was, but yeah. The Lyerlys were still living in the same old farmhouse near Barber Junction, about 11 miles west of Salisbury. Isaac had just kept to that same life he'd always known, farmed, raising crops. He did employ tenant farmers, the sharecroppers, to help with the land. So by 1906, he was 68 years old. He had lived through the Civil War, survived the years of Reconstruction, and outlived 2 wives. He was a Confederate veteran, a father many times over, and by then the head of a bustling household all over again, with his third wife, Gussie, managing the home and raising their younger children. And then that tragedy struck on that summer night in July of 1906. By the time daylight came, the girls were a wreck. The Lyerly place was crowded, neighbors stood in the yard, and law officers and reporters had come to check out the crime scene. The murder weapon was found right away just outside the front door, and it was the Lyerly family's own axe that still had some blood on it. Not a lot, so kind of keep that in mind. It had some blood on it.
Okay.
Buggies and saddled horses were in the grove. Groups of men were standing around talking. There were sycamores in their front yard. There were zinnias and hollyhocks that were in full bloom at the gate. Women and neighbors had come in to be with Mary, Addie, and Janie, the 3 survivors of the family. So they also came to dress the murdered family. On the steps and part of the yard were scattered feathers and burnt pieces of cloth. And in the hall, there were singed feathers and straw from the fire.
Mm-hmm. And the feathers, I'm assuming, from the bed.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then at the rear entryway, the coroners were holding their inquest. And I do want to give a warning here because I'm going to go into further detail about the bodies.
So it's going to be a little graphic.
Mm-hmm. The body of little John lay on the floor. Parts of his body were burned black and were coming loose off of his little body. Exactly in the top of his head, the blade of an axe had been driven perpendicular to his forehead. From the look of the cut, the axe must have sunk halfway to his eye. And from its position, he had to have been sitting up. Because the high head of the bed would have made that stroke impossible if he had been lying down sleeping.
Oh, that poor baby.
Isaac's body had been moved. I think I told you his daughters had moved him.
Mm-hmm.
His face was framed with gray hair and gray chin whiskers, but he looked perfectly calm. His eyes were closed. They believed that he was struck first and killed while he slept because there were 2 blows. However, one was on the front, and that seemed to have been made by the axe handle or a club or something. And then the other behind his left ear. And the latter was made with the butt of the axe, and it had crushed his skull completely in. His blood was all over the floor, his bedclothes, and his blood was actually all over all of their nightclothes and stuff. So he bled a lot, but at least he probably did not know what was coming.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Across the hall in the parlor was Miss Augusta. She was on the floor. Her face was white, and it said that she had a strange suggestion of a smile on her face. Her head lay on one side. It showed plainly the broadside blow of an axe, the butt of which had cut off the lobe of her left ear. And the print of the body and blade of the weapon remained on her jaw and neck.
Oh, gosh.
The worst of it, though, was that the axe blade had been struck through her skull parallel with and about half of an inch back from her forehead because she had been sitting up. They believed that she had woken, probably with her husband being killed, and she had sat up and then whacked. There were portraits of herself and her husband hanging side by side on the wall. They're in their dress in the bodies. And then they see these pictures, like her husband's portrait showed him in his Confederate uniform, and just so sad.
Yeah.
And then at about 3 p.m., little Alice succumbed to her injuries, and she passed away at the cook's home. By that evening, Rowan County Sheriff David R. Julian and his deputies had made arrests. They took into custody Nease Gillespie, his 2 sons. They also arrested George Irving, Jack Dillingham, and Della Dillingham. The Gillespies and Dillinghams, they all lived and worked on the Lyerly farm as sharecroppers. So the motive was said to have been a dispute between Nease Gillespie and Isaac Lyerly over the farm's wheat crop. Mr. Matt Webb, who was another tenant farmer who worked with Nease Gillespie, said that he heard Gillespie say to Mr. Lyerly, he can cut that wheat and he can thresh it, but he would never eat any of it or see any of the money for it. And then Mr. Lyerly's son had heard his father talk about this whole dispute. So what had happened was that Nease Gillespie had worked at the sawmill for Mr. John Dillinger, right? And he had moved into one of the Lyerly cabins last fall. He and his stepsons had agreed that they were going to work a certain part of the land and in exchange for living in this cabin. So there was a section that the wheat was supposed to be planted. The Gillespies, they did sow part of it, but they realized that I guess they could get more money at the sawmill or just doing day labor. And so they didn't sow that entire lot. But that wasn't what was in the contract between Mr. Lyerly and to them. And so Mr. Lyerly went to Nease. But finally it was settled because Mr. Dillinger, the sawmill owner, he agreed to just pay the rent for Gillespie. So nothing more was really heard of it until Mr. Lyerly went out and cut the wheat.
Okay.
And he was preparing to thresh it. And of course, this infuriated Nease Gillespie. He went down to the Lyerly house and asked him, what do you think you're going to do with that? And he said, I'm going to thresh it. When he told him that, they got into this huge, loud argument. And Mr. Lyerly ended up ordering him out of his yard. And that was supposedly when Nease Gillespie told Mr. Lyerly that he would kill him or die trying if he used that wheat without giving him a share of it.
Mm.
So, funny little side note, I don't know if I've ever told you this, but my great-grandmother, the one that I keep telling you about, her dad and brother were shot over a sharecropping dispute.
I think I knew that because didn't your mama write a song about it?
Yes. Because you have to think you were paid once a year for this stuff. And so if you didn't get paid, there were no welfare systems in place. Like, you really genuinely did not know what you were going to eat.
Okay.
I don't know exactly what happened in that case, but I can see it being a very huge, heated argument.
Right. Okay. So link your mom's video to the show notes because, that's an interesting little side note there.
Yeah, I'll do that. So when the crowd gathered at the Lyerly home that day and the men were arrested, Gillespie's wife actually ran to a neighbor's house, Mr. Dick, and begged him to protect her. She told him she was going to be hanged for killing the Lyerlys, but she had nothing to do with it. She told him, I don't know anything about it, but my husband does. So near the home of the Gillespies was a freshly burnt spot where a straw bed and other things had been burnt. In a gravel pit, they found pieces of clothing and about a spoonful of scorched blood. There was also a few feet away from the house, a shirt that had been boiled and was still wet, but it still had traces of blood on it. It had been located in a weed patch. So those little pieces of evidence were gathered, and they were building a pretty strong case.
Okay.
So the newspaper wasted no time in saying that they were the murderers.
Of course not.
Calling for them to be arrested, and they were. And before long, that mob mentality began to swell. Tensions grew so quick that the sheriff he did arrest them, but he quickly moved them out of Rowan County altogether and took them to Mecklenburg so that they could be safe. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile...
And Mecklenburg County is like Charlotte area.
Okay.
And so Salisbury is right outside of Charlotte. Not right outside, but...
close.
We go through Salisbury by Salisbury to get to Charlotte, so pretty close, yeah.
Meanwhile, on July 17th, the funeral services for the late Mr. and Mrs. Isaac Lyerly, their little daughter Alice, and their son Johnny were held at the Unity Presbyterian Church. The Reverend Mr. Spence conducted the services. So this church was an old church about 2 miles from their family home. All of the family were members there, as were the generations before them. I think the weather wasn't great that day. It looked like a thunderstorm was coming, but still there ended up being over 2,000 people that came to the Lyerly house and walked and gathered in that funeral procession.
Wow, that's a pretty big community there.
They had people from all over Salisbury, Statesville, Winston, and Charlotte.
Oh, my goodness.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But when the funeral procession reached the church, there were over 2,000 people that had fallen in line, which was over 1.5 miles long. To pay their last respects to their friend. It said that the Reverend Mr. Spence preached a beautiful sermon. The paper would read that no braver heroines ever lived than Mary, Addie, and Janie. Their father, mother, and 2 siblings were buried together in one grave. There were many beautiful flowers brought and sent from the towns and cities nearby. The sisters ended up staying with their neighbor, Mr. Barber, and then their uncle, Mr. Alex Lyerly of Cleveland, until everything was settled. Another interesting development happened when a 10-year-old little boy named Henry Gillespie, who was actually the son of one of the accused men, came forward saying that he had heard a story the night of the murders.
Okay.
That little boy ended up being the state's main witness.
And how old was he?
He was 10 years old.
Wow.
The paper said that this child told a story of brutality.
Oh, my gracious.
I know. He recited a straightforward and convincing manner the horrible plot that was made at Nease Gillespie's house the night of the murders. Nease was the boy's father.
I wonder what made him tell it.
I don't know. Well, that is the thing, because there's just always a question.
Sort of like that was like coerced out of him.
Yes, because he was very young.
Or they might have put the fear in him.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, I know they were terrified.
Yeah.
They arrested some people that had nothing to do with it just because they were acquaintances. Mm-hmm. And so I've read in some places that he was arrested and taken in, which I can see because I think everybody in his whole family was. Mm-hmm. His brothers, his dad, his uncle, even his grandfather. So I could see that. But then some say that he just went and did this on his own. So I don't know. I can't say for sure. I've read differing accounts. But here's what I do know happened. He said John Gillespie and his father, Nease Gillespie, met at their house at around 9 p.m. the night of the murders, and they plotted the murder of the family. Shortly after 9 o'clock, Nease and John Gillespie left the house. They returned hours later and sat down and told the story in detail as to how the 4 Lyerlys were killed. The boy said that his father said, "By God, we have killed old man Ike and his children." His grandfather, who was talking to his wife, said that they met Jack Dillingham and his wife at the branch. He said, "I killed old man Lyerly and his wife with my axe, and Jack Dillingham killed Alice and John with old man Ike's axe." He said that Dillingham's wife held the lamp while they were making way with the murders. When he was explaining what kind of lamp Dillingham's wife held, little Henry said that it was one of the church lamps that hangs on the wall. Henry then said that his father said that after killing the family, they set Mr. Lyerly's bed on fire with a match. He then told his wife that he was damn glad he had killed them and that they did it because the old man had not toted fair with them about the wheat deal. Henry Gillespie said that all the time Nease Gillespie, his father, was talking about the murders, John Gillespie was in the house and heard all that was said. The next morning, Nease piled all of his clothes on one side of the path leading from the house and throwing some straw over them, set fire to them and burned them up. John Dillingham's clothes were in piles on the opposite side, and they set fire with the aid of some straw from pillowcases, and they were burned. The boy said the next morning, bright and early, he went home with Mr. Walker, who lived down by the Lyerly home, and told him the detail of the crime, as told by the father the night before. He said he told Mr. Walker the same story he had told today. Now, here's another story. He told Mr. Walker, "I've got something to tell you, but I'm afraid that they'll kill me." And Mr. Walker actually put him in his wagon down at the foot and put a horse blanket over him and kept the little boy at his house to protect him. And after the trials, helped him move to a different community.
Wow.
And changed his name. Yeah.
And he was 10 years old.
10 years old. So there's that too. He said he told Mr. Walker the same story that he was telling today. He said there was still blood on Mr. Ike's axe because they couldn't wash all of it off, which that was true.
Right.
He also said that he saw the blood on the bosoms of the shirts that were worn by Nease Gillespie and Jack Dillingham the night of the murders. The 3 surviving sisters were also questioned that day as material witnesses. Each was examined and their story was the same as it had been before. So that Saturday night, soon after nightfall, a mob had gathered near Salisbury, near the jail at about 9:30 p.m.
Oh, I bet.
And they made a rush for the jail door. But Mr. John Julian, who was an editor of the Salisbury Post and the son of the sheriff, addressed the mob and told them, hey, the men are not here. And if you appoint a committee of 6, they would allow them to go through the jail and to look,
make sure
and
that
to
they're
make
not
sure
there.
that they weren't there. Mm-hmm. And so a part of the mob went into the jail. One man wore a mask because he didn't want his identity because he's in this mob. So there was no telling who he was. The others didn't even try to hide their identities. The mayor talked to the crowd and told them, look, the prisoners were sent to Charlotte, but the mob was insistent. In fact, when they went in, they smashed windows. I mean, they were violent.
What was the point of that?
Probably intimidation.
Oh. Well, and then the guy wearing the mask. I'm like, look, if you're going to be in a mob, at least, I mean, be man enough to show your face.
Exactly. It was silly. They sent 6 men in 3 different times before they would finally disperse.
Okay.
Yeah. At the Rowan County Jail, a reporter from the Charlotte News visited the accused. And all of them, except for one, which was the Gillespie's stepdad. So the boy Henry, the 10-year-old boy, this would have been his grandpa. And all of them but him refused to talk much. I mean, I guess they said we didn't do it or whatever, but they didn't talk much. But this guy, he was more than willing to tell his side. He was like, look, I did not know anything about the murders. He said that a neighbor, Mr. Barber, had came by his house early that morning and told him the news. And according to his account, he got up. It was kind of scared him at first. And then he went and got dressed and went down to the Lyerly farm, or to the home, which was only about 3/4 of a mile from his house because, like I said, he lived on the property. And that's when officers arrived and arrested him. He said that his 2 stepsons were taken in. The Gillespie boys had been plowing in a field at about 2 miles away from the Lyerly home when officers approached and arrested them. By late August of 1906, Rowan County was kind of a powder keg of anger and just anger over the murders. And it had been stoked by newspapers. I read these newspapers. They focused less on the family, which that's the sad part because I was looking for information about the family, but it was all about who they believed the murderers were. Mm-hmm. So, and that was just the talk of the town, was revenge on every street corner. So the arrest of the Gillespies and the Dillinghams really hadn't even calmed anybody down because they wanted them.
Mm-hmm. They want somebody to pay.
Yes. So because of the threat of the mob's violence and the prisoners being moved out of Rowan County, how do you say it? Rowan County. The prisoners, like I said, had been moved to Mecklenburg. And then by the end of August, the sheriff had arranged to bring them back to Salisbury for their trials. And that was going to set the stage for what happened next. 10 o'clock at night on August 8th, the crowd outside the Rowan County Jail had swelled to thousands. Word had spread that they were there, and groups of men had arrived from surrounding town, and that was the first time that they brought in the National Guard. So it didn't take long for a wedge of about 50 men to force themselves in through the jail doors and overpowered the officers. Now, 2 men had already been shot at this time, just in the chaos of all of this. Oh, wow. Yeah, they were there to show everybody they meant business. So they were shooting guns, and they were loud and belligerent, and they were tearing stuff up. So then the crowd surged in behind them, and within minutes, they emerged. And with them, they had Nease Gillespie, and they had Jack and Harrison, his 2 sons. Actually, they had more than that. They actually had 4 of them. The mob marched quietly towards Spencer. They stopped at Henderson's Ball Grounds just outside of town. And there, the Gillespies were given what the mob called a chance to confess. But the men are terrified. They refuse to confess or deny. John Gillespie, though, he wept openly and begged for his life, and he swore that he was innocent. The men were questioned, and then they were strung up one by one. At one point, a rope snapped, and the hanging had to be started all over again. They were also mutilated.
Oh, wow.
Like, one of them had their ears. I mean, it was a lot. I would tell all that in detail, too, because I think that's important, but I couldn't get exact information on that. So I heard that they were mutilated in one place, and then another, I heard that they weren't. So I don't know for sure what exactly was done. But I do know that after they had them strung up, the leaders ordered them to open fire, and they just shot into their bodies.
Were these 5,000 people just spectators, and some of them had guns, or?
Oh, yeah. Not all of them had guns. Some of them were kids.
Okay.
So not all of them. That was just how many people were there.
Okay.
But an incalculable number of shots were poured into the bodies. George Irvin, one of the accused, though, he was actually questioned by the mob and later returned to the jail. So I guess they believed him and put him back in jail. Took him back to the jail.
So that's interesting. I'm sitting here. So if they had confessed, they would have.
I don't know. I don't think he did confess. I think they believed.
He said he didn't do it, and they believed him.
Yeah,
so they let
whatever
him go.
He said, I guess they believed him, and they actually did send him back.
Well, yeah. I figure. I mean, like, that's really surprising. So
very surprising.
He got lucky there.
He really did. So actually, the newspaper article from the Salisbury Times was there, covering it, begging them not to do it the whole time, begging them not to do it. And also a relative of the Lyerlys even followed them and pled with them, just let them stand trial. Yeah. But the mob they just were not having it. So, of course, pictures were taken, which you can see online. It's horrible. I mean, it just looks, it's sad. I can't imagine. News reached Raleigh pretty quick. At about 11 that night, Judge Long phoned Governor Glenn, who wired orders for the militia units. Okay, this was the National Guard. And then, because I actually read an account from one of the National Guard years later that was there. They called in units from Charlotte, Greensboro, and Statesville to board special trains to Salisbury, but the order was too late. And by the time the troops arrived, the lynching was over. The governor later called it a blot on the state and promised that those responsible were going to be brought to justice. A handful of arrests actually were made in the weeks that followed. George Hall, an ex-convict from Montgomery County who was accused of leading the mob, was arrested and indicted. But I seriously doubt that he was the leader of that mob. I think he was probably just an easy one to pin the...
May have been one of the most vocal.
Exactly. Francis Cress, a well-known citizen of Salisbury, was also arrested and held without bail, and a few others were charged. But in the end, none of the major figures faced any lasting punishment. Whether they did it or not, they did not have due process, so we will never know. We don't know if they did it or not because there was no trial. There was not a lot of time in between their arrest. The murder happened on the 13th. They were arrested on the 14th of July. They were lynched on the 8th of August.
Okay, so about 3 weeks, maybe?
Yeah. We've since put up a marker for the people who were lynched, a historical marker. Because now everybody is saying like they didn't do it. I'm not going to say. I think they did it. There's a good chance that they did it.
With just the burning of those clothes and all of that sounds pretty convincing to me.
Another kind of interesting fact was that in August of 1902, so 4 years prior to this, in Rowan County, there were two really young black boys who were lynched. James Gillespie, who was about 11, and Harrison Gillespie, who was about 13. They were accused of killing a white woman named Addie Holzhauser while she worked in her field. And they were, of course, related to those Gillespies. That's just a really very interesting fact. Mm-hmm. But I don't know if you're familiar with the Basilica Axe murders.
Yes.
Okay, so I want to...
We talked about that one before.
We have talked about that one. So around this same time, all over the place, close to train tracks, families were being axed to death while they slept. Murder weapons were pulled from the family's own home. The blunt ends of axes were used, not the blades. They were both used in this particular one. Houses were often set on fire to hide the crime. Murders were always near railroad tracks to make an easy escape. So there was the Ackerman family that was killed in Florida in 1906 with an axe. The crime scene was so similar to the Lyerlys. The farmhouse, it was just eerie. The bodies in bed, the house set ablaze, the murder weapon left behind. Of course, the Basilica in Iowa was in 1912. 8 people murdered in their sleep. The Moore family and 2 visiting children were killed in that one. Their killer used an axe, bludgeoning them. In Palaio, Kansas in 1895, a family was murdered in their sleep, bludgeoned with an axe pulled straight from their woodpile. Nothing was stolen. No one reported hearing a thing. The killer vanished without a trace. In Ellisworth, Texas in 1900, another farm family met the same fate. Rayne, Louisiana in 1905, a family was slaughtered in bed. The house set on fire afterwards. So just crazy. You know, it sounds like what happened in Rowan County just a year later. There was actually this theory. Decades later, this theory started taking shape, and there was a book actually written about it, and it was called The Man from the Train.
Oh, yes. I've got that book. I do know what you're...
Okay.
Yeah, I know that theory.
By Bill James and his daughter Rachel. And the Lyerly murders are listed among a string of eerily similar killings across the country that happened at that time. Whole families murdered at night. The pattern stretched from small towns in the Midwest to the Deep South and right through Rowan County. James argues that these killings were not isolated acts of local anger at all, but the work of a traveling serial killer, the man from the train. And if that's true, the Lyerly family could have been a victim of a stranger passing through and not of those tenant farmers.
But it's interesting timing that it came right after a big argument between the 2 families and the guy saying he wasn't going to get that wheat.
It is, but you got to think. You remember in the case of the Wolford family murders, look at how obviously it looked like one person. And then in the end, we're like, oh, it probably wasn't that person.
Yeah.
So
it does happen.
It really does. I mean,
which is why everybody should have due process.
Exactly. That is so true. And I was just going to say, we just do not know what happened. And I think we can't stand that because we really don't know for sure what happened. And part of that is because of the lack of due process. Mm-hmm. Due process, though, is what stands behind justice and vengeance. And it's the right to a fair trial, you know, the chances to hear evidence, to defend yourself, to face your accusers. And in Rowan County in 1906, we just didn't get that. And a mob became the judge, jury, and executioner. And in doing so, they not only took lives, but they robbed the truth from history.
Right. I do think everybody has a right to a fair trial.
Yes.
But I think sometimes once they've had that trial, justice needs to be a little bit more swift.
Oh, I agree with that too.
I think the mob mentality, sometimes they're just wanting quick justice.
Right.
When they're convinced in their minds, this is who did it. Let's have this justice very quickly.
Right.
But then, like you said, in America, everybody should have a fair trial.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. And in this case, too, there were other lives taken that were completely innocent of any of this, by that mob. And I think that's the danger when vengeance takes the place of justice, that the Lord requires to do justly.
Mm-hmm. He is a God of justice. That's right.
And due process, it's not just a legal principle. It's a safeguard against, like your anger take over.
Sure, yeah. And like you said, and even if indeed those guys are guilty, which I feel like they are, I feel like those guys probably did commit those murders. So if they did, then like you said, now there's this monument to them, making them the victims. And that's certainly not justice.
Now they're heroes to a lot of people.
Yeah.
And they have this in history.
This legacy. And about that mob taking that justice in their own hands might have robbed that family of real justice.
Yes. Yes, that's so true.
Well, those were some hard times.
Yes, they were.
Well, anybody that lives around here knows that Salisbury is known best for being the place you drive through on your way to Charlotte. But that's what's great about hard times and true crimes. And once you get done liking and subscribing and buying the girls a coffee, you can download every single episode and take it with you to whatever little town you drive through on your way to somewhere better. So you make sure you tell everybody you know, and a few people you don't, to check out Hard Times and True Crimes. Till next time, goodbye.